It's taken as given that in 2020 the watch industry is doing really badly, and that's largely true, except for Microbrands. So they seem to be doing pretty well. I think there might be some things the big boys, the macro brands, could learn from that. Hi, welcome back to Not So Obvious Watches. I'm Pete McConville. It would seem strange that multi-billion dollar companies could learn something from mom and pop shops operating out of garages and kitchen tables. But I think it is true. I think we can see in 2020 that the microbrand way of doing business has a form of resilience that the macro brand doesn't really have, or doesn't have to the same extent. I think that the macro brands can learn from some of the behaviors, some of the structures that micro brands have to better provide for their futures and perhaps be more successful in the long run. Now, before I go on, I'd say that these are general rules. These are sort of general philosophies. No macro brand wants to shrink to become a micro brand. None of these brands that are selling tens of thousands of watches want to be selling hundreds of watches a year. So they're not going to become micro brands. They're not going to one-for-one copy their methods. These are broad principles, I think, that the macro brands could consider. Before I go on, why is it that a micro brand, a mom and pop, a couple on school holidays can sort this out when big brands with hundreds of business people and thousands of employees can't? I think there's really four things that give micro brands a real advantage in the 21st century. The first is that they're new, that they've had to think about how to do business. Most macro brands sometimes they don't even have the opportunity to think about what they do. They've got habits, they've got procedures, they've got protocols that they follow. And so they just don't really think hard about how to do things. And when they do, their idea of a radical change is a 5% change one way or the other on something they're already doing. The next thing is that when a micro brand is thinking about what they're going to be and how they're going to operate, they're doing it in the 21st century. They're doing it now in this context. Everything they're thinking, everything they're designing, most of the experience of the people that are establishing micro brands has only ever been in a world where there is an Amazon, an eBay, where there are forums, where there is Instagram, where e-commerce is the way that things are done. That gives them a massive advantage in when they're doing their thinking, having that contextualized correctly. The next thing I'd say, and I'm not sure if micro brands can really use this, is micro brands have got legal freedom to do pretty much whatever they want. They don't have pre-existing customers, that they have warranty claims and warranty things to deal with. They don't have pre-existing employees that they have to worry about labor relations and pre-existing employment contracts. They don't have distribution deals that they're tied to. They don't own massive premises that they have to pay rent on. They haven't spent millions of dollars on inventory that must be sold. So micro brands have got a lot of legal freedom to move around that the big brands don't have. That legal freedom then reinforces all of that intellectual freedom I was talking about earlier, further enabling these micro brands to think of new and innovative ways to do business. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, the micro brands are called micro brands, not micro makers, for a reason. They are, from their very inception, from the very first germ of the idea, focused on the idea of making a product and selling it to an end user, selling it to someone who will reach into their own pocket, spend their own money, and buy that thing. So many macro brands are the results, are the final product, are the final evolution of companies which were originally business to business manufacture. And that is baked deep into their corporate psyches. Take a brand like JLC, for example. They existed and were selling watches for a quarter of a century before they even had a brand name. That deep corporate history impinges on the very way companies see themselves and their relationship to their customers. And you can see it come through with the way they... When a lot of brands speak, it's almost like they're not talking to you. It's like they're talking to a distributor who's then going to be talking to a retailer who may end up talking to you. And that's why so much of their messaging is kind of stilted and weird and doesn't work very well. The microbrands, on the other hand, they know, they're right from the beginning, they're talking to that guy who's going to reach into his pocket, pull out his credit card and buy your product. And that change in focus, that different focus of who we're talking to, which is absolutely, not second nature. It's the first thing. It's the only thing that microbrands think about. I don't think that it comes naturally to most macro brands. So with all of that difference, what is it that I think the macro brands can learn? The first is probably that last point I just mentioned. They must shift their focus to talk to the consumer. They must actively stop talking as if they are talking. They've got to stop themselves thinking that they are talking to other people in the industry. They have to start talking directly to consumers. And thinking that is the person who is reading all of the stuff that's coming out. I think if they can make that shift, then a lot of what will come next, a lot of what I'm going to talk next, will start to become a lot easier. The next thing I would say is that, like microbrands, the first person that they need to be talking to is the enthusiast market. What this pandemic has shown is that the enthusiasts are the last people to leave your brand. No matter what else is going on, they will be the last people to be reaching into their pocket and buying your product. And then when times become good, they'll be the first people to start doing it again. Now, they're not enough. You can't, and I'm going to talk about this more later, you've got to be cautious not to over-focus on your enthusiast market. But I think too many macro brands think in terms of how do we sell 1 million watches to the world, and then consider how would we build an enthusiast group within it, rather than the other way round. And there you see a lot of micro brands who are now, and Christopher Ward's a great example, and Bremont probably as well, who are growing rapidly out of that micro brand world because they've done that really well. They're focused on enthusiasts, built a solid base, and expanding from that rather than the other way round. And I think that's... Now, once you're going to start focusing on the enthusiasts, there's a lot of lessons that you can draw from micro brands because that's what they do. They are often called enthusiast brands. And that's the first thing, is that the macro brands have got to get better at knowing how we think. Now, I'm a tiny channel with a very small footprint, no clout at all in the industry. But on the other hand, I have reached out to a couple of brands. I've sent them emails and occasionally they've answered. And what I've been able to glean is that they don't get us at all. They don't get us as enthusiasts. Things that we think are hidden and difficult to understand, they think are perfectly transparent and are easy for anyone to work out. Things that we think are really important, they don't think are important at all. Things that we don't particularly value, they think are super important and go without saying. And this leads to enormous issues of mistrust between them and us. We think they're hiding stuff that they think is plain. They think that we're being picky over things that we really value, but they don't seem to get. So I think the brands have really got to reach out and do a better job of understanding enthusiasts, and then being more transparent with them, and making an effort to never pander, and this is going to be something I talk about again a lot, but to understand and then consider when they're moving forward. Now, having spoken about focusing on enthusiasts as your starting point, then working to understand enthusiasts, the next thing that microbrands can teach macrobrands is about the use of the media to reach those enthusiasts. Too many macrobrands are still living in the past when it comes to how they talk to people. Even when they do go on and use social media and use new marketing avenues, they do it in a very old-fashioned way. They release press releases and so forth. I'll give you a hint if you are from a major brand and you're watching this. YouTubers and podcasters and vloggers and all that sort of stuff are all doing this in their spare time. They're all enthusiasts. They're all rushing. They don't read your press releases. I've seen so many reviews and opinion pieces across the social media parts of the new media of a bunch of releases this year. And it's clear no one read any of the press material. People don't, they get the pricing wrong, they get the materials wrong, they get the market segment wrong, they get what the watch company is trying to achieve with this wrong. They just get all sorts of things wrong, and they almost take pride in that, because being authentic means not getting sucked into the marketing messages of the brand. You can avoid that by simply turning up on the podcast, turning up with the YouTuber, having the YouTuber come and visit you. That is what the microbrands do. What microbrands don't issue press releases. They phone someone and talk to them about what they're going to do. And then that discussion is taped and then it's sent out into the world. And because the YouTuber is talking to you, because the podcaster is talking to you, a relationship is formed. They pay more attention. They pass on the messaging much more accurately. And you miss this whole misinterpretation part. Microbrands do it all the time. They're constantly turning up on YouTube and on podcasts and on vlogs and giving personal interviews. The big brands hardly ever do it. They send a press release out and hope for the best, and what they get is the worst. They've got to stop being proud, and they've got to start getting on the front foot. And there are some macro brands who are doing that, and they do it beautifully. Oris, I think, Oris is what it is now because of exactly that. Because it stepped out from behind the veil. It stepped out from behind its press release. It's actively engaged with a lot of YouTubers, with a lot of podcasters, with a lot of bloggers, and it's become a darling brand. Regardless of whether you like their watches or not, they have created a community that will engage with them. Because, as I said, they've stepped out from behind the press release and they're now talking directly to people in partnership with vloggers and podcasts and bloggers, etc., rather than just hoping that the messages are filtered correctly. The next thing I think the macro brands can learn from micro brands is control your distribution and your pricing. One of the things that makes buying a micro brand a lot easier, paradoxically feels more secure, is that you can be pretty confident that if you place an order for a microbrand watch and it's $1,000 and you buy that watch for $1,000, you can be pretty confident that next week you're not going to see that same watch at Joma Shop at 50% off. And I think that uncertainty about pricing, that feeling that if I buy this watch from the boutique, I'm going to lose vast amounts of money, even if I never sell it. Even I might not lose it on the resale value, but I will feel the pain of being ripped off when 3 weeks from now I see it on Joma Shop or I see it on Chrono24. One of the things that microbrands can teach macro brands is that you've got to be disciplined about your distribution. In the old days, I think there was a fear that if you missed a sale because there wasn't a product available, then that money was gone forever and you were never getting it back. And that probably led to a lot of this overproduction of making sure that there was always a watch available for someone to buy it. I think in the 21st century, when we have masses of grey markets that you can see easily and quickly check, and we all know what the pricing can be, and with a quick Google search we can see 27 different prices for a product. That model doesn't work anymore, and I think microbrands know it and macrobrands don't. The idea of uncertainty on price, the fear that I might get ripped off because I'm going to be overcharged, might gain you a sale now, but will probably lose you 10 sales later. I think that microbrands know that it is better to miss a sale today, but bake in 4 or 5 sales later. And that's something that I think macro brands have got to learn. The final lesson I would say that the macro brands have got to learn from the micro brands is about the new way of engaging with people in the 21st century. Macro brands were mostly formed at a time when that engagement was done at arm's length through some kind of avatar. And what I mean by that is I engaged with you because I sponsored someone to dive to the depths of the ocean or to go to the moon, and you got to buy a product that was vaguely associated with them, and that was enough. That created an engagement. In the 21st century, I don't think that works anymore. I don't think that is enough. I think the engagement needs to be much more personal. It's not enough anymore that I own a watch that's the same as the watch that was owned by someone that you gave money to. It's more now, I need to own a watch and be in a Facebook group with the brand. I need to be followed by and follow the brand on Instagram. I need to know that when I buy this watch, if the brand is doing something for the environment, when I buy this watch, a tiny percentage of my money, maybe a few cents of my money, ends up going to that as well. So not only do I get to watch someone else do something through the brand, but I get to personally participate to some extent. Microbrands do that beautifully. They build wonderful communities around Facebook groups and everything. The brands themselves get involved in it. They create these links between the person buying the watch and the end product. And that really creates bonds that people want to be involved in much more effectively than the older model, which some brands are still persisting with, and it's not really cutting through. Again, some macro brands are doing that wonderfully at the moment, and I will point you, no one's doing that better than Oris right now. And I think, forget their watches, it's that engagement and community building that's really driving the power of Oris at the moment. And it's something that I think every macro brand can learn from the micro brands. Now, all of those are positive lessons. Those are all things that the micro brands can teach the macro brands to do, to focus on the consumer, to focus on the enthusiast, to understand how the enthusiast thinks, to use the new media to speak to the enthusiast and the wider community, to engage with the enthusiast and the wider community rather than through some avatar. Those are all positive lessons, but there's a negative lesson as well. Remember, I said no macro brand wants to be a micro brand. One of the things that a macro brand has to do is learn that none of that is enough, and all of that can be a trap. All of that can end up leading a brand down into a cul-de-sac where it ends up with a small group of incredibly committed enthusiasts and no one else buying their watches. And some of the things I see that micro brands do that drive themselves into that cul-de-sac are things that the big boys have to avoid. The first is, as I said before, you've got to know your enthusiast base, you've got to cater to them, but a lot of micro brands pander to their enthusiast base. And that word pander means appeal to the worst instincts. What a lot of micro brands do is they've found a community of 4,000 or 5,000 people who will buy that watch, and only that watch, and only if this watch does this exact thing, and they're perfectly happy to sell them to it. And then they get positive feedback and they keep making that same watch, and they shrink down to become just that thing, and that's all they do. And now there's brands who I don't think will ever break out of that microbrand space because they're stuck in that rut. They have so pandered to a small group of very loyal enthusiasts that they won't be able to get back out. The next thing is a sort of an extension from that. If you do find yourself in that position, and most macro brands do have dedicated groups of enthusiasts who desperately want certain things from their brands, the macro brands have both the ability and the need to occasionally cut some of those fans free and realize that if for them to keep servicing that market will ultimately 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years from now, hold the brand back and stop it from being what it can be. Two of the brands I follow right now, I think are in that process. I think both Seiko and Breitling are actually now surgically carving away some of their loyal enthusiast base, because even though it's going to cost them in the short term, I think in the long run, they've worked out that keeping those people costs them more in the really long run. That's got to be a difficult decision, but it's a difficult decision that macro brands have to make if they don't want to become micro brands. And the thing that every macro brand that wants to emulate some of these strategies of micro brands, and that every micro brand that wants to become a macro brand needs to figure out how to do, is run at two speeds at once. Walk and chew gum. Create an enthusiast group, foster them, care about them, give them what they want to an extent, educate them, be transparent with them, and at the same time stretch the boundaries, be something more, appeal to non-enthusiasts, appeal to beyond your core group. That's a real challenge. That's something that's worth a whole video in its own right. It's probably beyond my expertise to even give advice on. But that is certainly something that a macro brand has to learn to do, and has to learn to, and has got to be very careful about, if it's going to learn lessons from micro brands, not to learn the wrong ones. So that's it. You'll notice I didn't give a very specific sort of do this, sell on it, go to e-commerce, or follow this path, because I don't think there is a one size fits all answer for all brands, for all markets, for all market segments, for all geographical distribution areas. I think it's more about tendencies and beliefs and general approaches. And I also realize that at the end, a macro brand does actually is trying to achieve some different aims often to a micro brand. So care must be taken in even how you apply some of these lessons. But anyway, what do you think? Do you think I'm talking out of my ass? Do you think that none of this would work for a macro brand? Do you think that I've largely got it right but didn't go far enough? Give me your thoughts downstairs in the comments below. What do you think, if anything, the big boys can learn from the micro brands? I've been Pete McConville. This has been Not So Obvious Watches, and I'll see you later. Bye.